Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Magic Draft Review once again. I am Emmeline, and I'm currently being haunted by moths. It's all being done in one unbroken take for the most part, since we don't have a lot of time to do editing with the amount of time left to Modern Horizons 3. So there might be some flailing going on in this video. We'll see. Anyways, I can't think of a better time to review back than Black than when being harassed by large bugs. So let's go ahead and talk about these cards, shall we? All right. First things first, we got a Cursed Marauder, and hey, we're not starting things off with a card that is absolutely ridiculously good. I think the last couple of them, it's been like pretty solid legendary in the A range. So yeah, let's go ahead and talk about this. So first things first, Accursed Marauder, 2 cost 2/1. Oh, brief reminder on our grading scale. S, super bombs, very, very good cards that will basically always be splash worthy, really, really strong and tend to win the game. A, it's something that's really, really good in our colors, and it is very likely to win us the game, and it doesn't take a lot of support. It's just a generally good card that does amazing things. B, it's a generally good card that is going to do something really, really nice for us. Like, it's not necessarily going to win us the game, but it might be pretty good. If it is a difficult combo to set up, but it does do a lot of work, then that leans it a little bit more towards a B. We're looking for a balance of reliability and power as well. So we want something that's very reliable, and if it's not reliable, it needs to be very powerful. C, we are looking at the common cards that tend to fill out most drafts. These are the cards that are going to be pretty common basically everywhere. We want to play as many like C pluses as we can for the most part, but in general, all decks are going to have a bunch of C's, and that's not going to be too big of a deal. A D, that's the card that's in your hand where if it's in your hand, you might. The card that is in your hand when you die is the way that I most often define it. It's a card in draft that you're pretty unhappy to pick, that you try to cut as whenever possible. But if you have to play it, you might. And an F is a card that you're basically absolutely never going to play in a draft. It's a card that you basically shouldn't play in a draft. Sometimes that's a difficult combo that when assembled, like, doesn't even provide you with all that much advantage. Sometimes that's a card that simply is very bad on rate or doesn't do the thing it's supposed to do or is simply broken in a way that would grant it a failing grade. So yeah, with all that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into it. First things first, Cursed Marauder, as we were saying, a 2-drop 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a non-token creature. So non-token does matter here, and I think it does raise this thing from being like an F to a D. I don't like this card very much. I think it's you know, they're definitely like potential for this to be even higher than a D, but I just feel like there's a couple of different things that are kind of holding it back. First thing, this is a sorcery speed sacrifice effect that gets your opponent's worst creature and can kind of stall aggro attacks. So you can play it on turn 2 if you're on the draw, and it will kill their 2-drop. And if you play it on turn 3 on the play, then it'll, potentially kill something there too. It might get a creature and like at least keep the board like kind of stable for a while. It has some synergy with creatures on your side of the board that want to die, which can potentially grant you a little bit of upside. There aren't that many creatures which you're like super, super happy to sacrifice just for the effect of sacrificing. And when your opponent is sacrificing stuff as well, like there's a potential that they might sacrifice something they want to sacrifice, which means there are times when this is really pretty unplayable. And that's not something you really want to see out of a 2-drop. Now, only if the synergy is valid is this card a reasonable pick. I think otherwise it's really difficult to take. You're probably going to end up with a bunch of these anyways because they tend to filter to the bottom of the packs, but you're going to try to cut them whenever possible. They at least do some work, but I just feel like there's a lot of potential ways that you can get skunked by them or in ways in which they aren't going to be that powerful. They make it pretty hard to pick black as like a primary color because they're a common 2-drop. So it's tricky, it's tough. I think a lot of stuff your opponents can sacrifice, they're going to be pretty happy sacrificing. I think a lot of stuff that you can sacrifice, you're not going to be very happy sacrificing, so you're more likely to just kill the Accursed Marauder. It can't get like their tokens or stuff like that, or rather like the token stuff like means that it's like kind of limited in its scope. And yeah, there's a lot of potential where this like just doesn't really work as your sacrifice option. You generally want better options for sacrificing creatures than this one, and it's hard to play this card as a way to enable a sacrificer. So I don't know, I'm just really pretty down on it. Arcbound Condor. This is a B+. So it's 4 mana 3/3. It is a flying modular 3. 4 mana 3/3 flyer is usually always a pretty good stat line to be aiming for when you're looking at draft mechanics. It's just big enough to actually deal a bunch of damage. It's just evasive enough to like kind of get there. It's healthy enough to survive in most situations, and it's barely good enough on raid, which is usually pretty important. Being barely good enough on raid is much better in this format than usual, just due to the fact that a lot of the like big drops cost 7. So if you can get like stuff that's good on rate, you can potentially end a lot of games before they really truly begin, and that can be pretty relevant. Whenever the artifact enters the battlefield under your control, target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. This will kill quite a few creatures in the format. Many of the 2-drops are 2/1s, including a Cursed Marauder, though that's not really the one that you're looking at. It will definitely get like several options in red, blue, green. There is a green 2/1, there's a red 2/1. There's a lot of cards that actually have just 1 health. There's a white 3/1 for 3 that's actually pretty decent-ish. And yeah, there's just a lot of stuff that kind of does die when you play artifacts in this format. Black is kind of one of the big artifact synergy colors, and this is something where you're reasonably likely to get something out of it, so might be pretty reasonable on that front. So solid upside there. The modular is also very good, because when it dies, you can put its +1/+1 counters on another artifact creature. If you're playing black artifact creatures at all, this is a pretty huge bonus to get. I wouldn't say that this is always going to be amazing, but it's still decent. It kills small creatures if it sticks. It sets up some interesting like combat tricks if you've got flash artifacts. There aren't any flash artifacts in black, but you know, it's kind of the interesting thing in general. And then like overall, like I think it's a good card without any other required cards to pick it. So yeah, not bad to pick. I'd give it a B or a B+. I think B+ is pretty reasonable. All right, Boggart Trawler, 2 and a black. When Boggart Trawler enters the battlefield, exile target creature's player's graveyard. We're going to try to keep these lands out of the review in general, but yeah, this is currently listed decently high just because it's a smallish creature that's also a land. Okay. Breathe Your Last. 1 black, destroy target creature or planeswalker. You gain 1 life for each of its colors. It's instant speed removal. It's slightly below rate because you can't do it at 2, but it's not very selective, which is one of the things that's very common with black removal. You'll get something that's like non-outlaw or non-color, whatever, and just like basically this is something that actually kills the thing. It does give you a little bit of life, which is actually kind of useful for reasons we might talk about. There are a bunch of like unusual black bombs that care about life gain, so this is a nice bonus. I'd say overall this is a B. This is a great piece of removal that you're pretty happy to play. It's instant speed, which is always good because you can use those to create like even better situations for yourself in certain combat scenarios. And it's you know, it's a little bit steep on that influence cost, which I think lowers it from the B+ I originally had it at, but overall I think it's fine. Okay, Buried Alive. 2 and a black, search your library for up to 3 creature cards, put them into your graveyard, unshuffle. This is a slow, synergy-only card. It's sorcery speed, and it costs 3 mana. It fully wastes a card. You don't get any card advantage out of it. So it's entirely there to set up combos for creature cards, where you can play a creature card from your graveyard, like do something with like a resurrection option. This has no value in draft unless your deck already has a lot of good graveyard effects. It's pretty unlikely to like do anything interesting. I give this an F. I think it'll go last in draft unless the synergy is like really strong. So like it's possible you might pick this up at the very end of a game where you actually have a bunch of creatures that go to yard and all of that other stuff assembled, but you never pick this first. It's just not worth it on that respect. So yeah. Chthonian Nightmare. A little weird and fiddly enchantment. It's a 1 and a black. When it enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy. You can pay X energy to sack a creature, return Chthonian Nightmare to its owner's hand, and return target creature card with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield. So, energy is very interesting. Not very common in black overall. I wouldn't say it's a common energy format. So this is not going to be as playable in these colors as it is going to be other colors. You kind of want to like splash for this and something that's like red or blue or white. Okay, so yeah, as far as things go, like you get to potentially get a creature back from the graveyard, but it costs you another creature. So you can eat a token to get back something that's like a 2 or 3 drop. But like activate as a sorcery really kind of feels like the nail in the coffin here. I think this is like a D plus. I think it's just not that great. It's reasonably likely to wheel. You're probably not super happy to pick it up. It's potentially kind of a combo if you can rotate two creatures with enter the battlefield exit effects that actually like give you energy, but then you also have to keep paying for Chthonian Nightmare when you do that, so that can really kind of occupy the entire space, and I think there's just better ways to generate energy as far as that goes. So yeah, this is not a strong one. It's definitely an interesting constructed build around, but I don't think it's particularly good here. All right, Consuming Corruption's up next. Double black, deal X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life, where X is the number of swamps you control. Most of the other colors do not really support like a kind of mono-color deck, but black really seems to have quite a bit of support for it. So that's something that like is notable, is that if you're going black, you might not be synergizing quite as well with other colors. You might actually just be playing a lot of black cards, and it's possible that you can kind of get into that space and do some interesting things with it. I'd still only put this at like a C plus. I think it is cheap removal. It does good damage. It gives you a decent amount of life, which is pretty nice. It can kill planeswalkers, which is always helpful, but kind of par for the course for black at these points. And overall, it's just like, are you going to draft a monocolored deck? That's something that makes it a little bit less likely to play. So even though this card is pretty frequently a B in the black deck only, it's just like there's so few options where you're drafting it all the time. So yeah, it removes some options from you, but at least you're murdering stuff and gaining life. It's always going to be at least beneficial in that respect. C plus is probably as high as I can give it, but I do think the card is pretty good in the mono black deck. So all right, Crabomination. So 5/5 Crab Demon. That demon thing is kind of relevant for reasons we might eventually talk about. So yeah, it is 4 black black 5/5. It has emerged from artifact 5 black black, which means you can cast the spell by sacrificing an artifact and paying the emerge cost reduced by that artifact's mana value. So for example, there is a 3 cost mana rock in this one that produces 2 mana. So you could play that on 3, and then you could pay 2 from it, sack it for the additional 3, and play this card for black, black. That's like one of the more interesting combos that the card can do. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent exiles the top card of their library, as well as a card at random from their graveyard, and a card at random from their hand. You can cast a spell from among cards exiles this way without paying its mana cost. So, discard a card. That means the card is worth card advantage when it is played, which is decent. I mean, for a 6-drop 5/5, that feels pretty okay. It also gets a card from their graveyard, which you do not get to choose. So that's not particularly useful or even all that fun. It's not great in like paper Magic where you have to shuffle your graveyard and like shuffle your hand, and it just takes forever to actually resolve this thing. But we're mostly talking about arena drafting, so at the very least, I mean, if you are in paper drafting, like this is something that's gonna be a little bit difficult to like play, and yeah, it's just gonna add some steps to the whole process. So might be a little less appealing on that respect. Okay, so you do get to discard the card, which is 1 card advantage. Then you get to play the card, which is 2 card advantage, and you can cast that spell without paying its mana cost. So fairly okay if you can get a really good card out of one of those 3 different options, which I would say at random you're still pretty likely to do. They get the top card of the library, card at random from graveyard, card at random from hand, so all of it's completely random, but not too bad of a chance to hit, and you get 2 cards worth of advantage out of it, as well as a pretty significant tempo swing from potentially playing their removal or a big Eldrazi, or even just like a small 2/2 or something like that. Feels decent. I'd say that this is pretty good. It's good with like a lot of like modular artifact creature stuff. It messes with scry, interestingly enough. Your opponent scries, you can use this to like make their scry that they picked go away and also potentially play it. It's potentially just a huge spike to win the game, but it could also just hit 3 lands. I give this like an A minus. I think it is a really playable card. It's an easy cost to play. It's a fairly early pick, and then you can just look for artifacts afterwards to get it together, which is not too bad. There's a lot of good black artifacts. So yeah, this is pretty close to a B plus, but I'd give it an A minus. All right, Dreadmobile. Artifact vehicle, Menace. It's a 3/3. You can sack another artifact or creature to put a +1/+1 counter on it. It crews for 1, which is pretty easy to crew. Vehicles tend to be a little tricky on tempo because opponents can always like remove the crew and then you just can't really like crew it quite as well. But this one crews pretty easily and can crew most tokens except for like Eldrazi spawn. It's pretty capable of just like always being able to be sort of on ground as far as stuff goes. There's a lot of 3-cost 3/3s in the format, but as far as like sacrifice another artifact or creature to get a +1/+1 counter, it goes. That's not a bad thing to trick on, and I think it works pretty well. I'd give this a C+. I think it's not like a premier creature of the set, but it could potentially get there. And yeah, overall it's totally fine. Nothing too wild, but the menace does help a lot here, and the card's got a reasonable amount of value going through it. I think in general, I'd rather play the 3/3 reach creature in red that does the same thing without having to crew, but that one doesn't have the cool combat trick potential, which I don't think you're using very often, but I think still is nice if you are just trying to dodge a particular piece of removal and you want to sacrifice something a little less valuable. Dream Drinker Vampire, 2/1 for 2. Lifelink, adapt 1. If this creature has no +1/+1 counters on it, you put a +1/+1 counter on it for 2 mana. So play it on 2. On turn 3, you can make it a 3/2, which is definitely not like a terrible creature on tempo because you're attacking with that 3/2. And it gets menace when you do that because whenever you put a +1/+1 counter on it, it gains menace until end of turn. Okay, so solid 2-drop, lifelink on a 2/1, plus the ability to do some other stuff. It feels pretty good. The menace is a nice little bonus and will frequently allow you to get more life out of it as a result. I think it's a B- common. I think it is something where you can actually do a lot of good stuff. You're going to want to play it a lot more often than you're going to want to play that sacrifice card, just because it is always like going to be pretty good on the board and it's never going to be like particularly unreliable. I think it's a strong pick for the 2-drop slot. You should pick it pretty highly if you want a good curve. Drustclaw. 1 and a black. It's a living weapon. Gets +1/+1 to a creature. Whenever the equipped creature attacks, each opponent loses 1 life. I had this at a D. I have seen it in play, and I think I'd move it up to like a C-. It's not a great creature, but the artifact is still pretty strong. Like being able to equip this thing to other creatures tends to be pretty dramatic when you are trying to push an aggro board or trying to just push a lot of flyers and like white-black. So like basically, it just makes every single enemy a little bit more threatening, deals 2 more damage instead of 1 more damage, because when it attacks, you lose 1 life. And also, the lose 1 life ability tends to be a little bit difficult to dodge. I think this is not a ridiculously good card, but it has artifact synergies, and it is just a creature on its own that eventually becomes an equipment, which honestly, Living Weapon is something I was not rating highly enough. So yeah, C- to a C. Great card. Or at least good card. that's where the C's are. They're fine. All right. Emperor of Bones. Okay, so 2 cost. Beginning of combat on your turn, you exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. That card stays exiled, so keep that in mind. 1 and a black, adapt 2. So you can turn this into a 4/4 if it does not already have +1/+1 counters on it. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Emperor of Bones, put a creature card exiled with Emperor of Bones onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter on it. It gains haste, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. Okay, just double checking that adapt is in fact instant speed. Yep, you can do that whenever you want. All right, so this is one of my qualifiers for like S ranked. It's potentially that good. It's a super good rate. It's always playable as a bear. It's not a legendary, so you can play as many of them as you want. Solves for recursion on the opponent's side, which is a pretty important thing to solve for because like just there's a lot of potential ways that like things can go very wrong from the graveyard of your opponent. So it's nice to have that little extra advantage. The adapt makes it a 4/4, which is incredible value and incredible tempo. It's insanely aggressive pressure. And it's even more aggressive pressure if it eats a good creature, because if you manage to get something out of their deck, then it's just kind of gonna be like pretty ridiculous. It recurs enter the battlefield effects of your own creatures, and just kind of makes it amazing. It can repeat the same creature multiple times since the creature leaves exile to go into play, and then it goes back into your graveyard and you can exile it again. So you can continually repeat other cards by getting this thing going. All you have to do is figure out a way to take the tokens off of it, which isn't that easy because of the adapt giving you 2+1/+1 tokens instead of 1, but there are a lot of potential ways that you can do it, and also a lot of ways that you can put +1/+1 counters on this as a trick in black-green, or as a just general like sort of option for a modular deck. I think this card's pretty gross. It's an A+ to potentially an S. It's an insane rare. I would definitely snap pick it pretty early. I would snap pick a big bone pack one basically every time because I know that whatever other deck I want to build, this card can definitely go in it. So yeah, this is definitely like, this is sort of where I want to be with a card that is just like both reliable and also quite capable of winning the game. So yeah, it's good stuff. All right, Etch Slith, 1 and a black for a 1/1 menace. When it deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on. When you do, you can remove a counter from another target permanent or opponent. It does have menace, so that means it's pretty likely to get across for that first hit and get to a 2/2. So also, that's probably might be where it ends, but I still think this is kind of interesting. So it's mildly evasive with a little bit of inevitability, because if it continues to get the hits, then you get a lot of counters. It's a modular creature, so that's lovely. The 1/1 does sometimes die pretty quickly, but I just don't think there's that many things that kill this thing very fast. There's not that many like 1 damage effects overall. It can eat enemy tokens, and that is where like the value really starts to happen. I think the thing that's most common for this, and the thing that people are going to forget a lot, is that this card eats energy tokens. You can use it to consume energy tokens on your opponent, and then that will reduce the amount of like interesting things that they can do with energy, make it a lot harder for them to play their like ridiculous energy bombs. And since it's got menace, it's just like fairly likely to continue to do that for a while, because energy creatures are not honestly that good at keeping tempo up so that this card doesn't spiral out of control. I'd say this is like a C card generally. It's a little bad on rate, but it's got high synergy because of its artifact status, its token management, its enemy interaction, and it's just kind of general inevitability. This is pretty decent despite looking like nothing. So yeah, not bad. Ethereum Terramander. 1 black for a 1/1. It's a flyer, and it can block only creatures with flying, so about the worst type of 1/1 that you can get. 6 and a black to adapt 4. This costs 1 less to activate for each other artifact you control, but that turns it into a 5/5 flyer for 8 if you wanted to just play it and adapt it immediately. So, yeah, so this is a okay early game card. Definitely not bad. The adapt is kind of bad on rate, but it does give you a pretty good mana sink if you've got nothing else to do on turn 7. A 5/5 is a fairly legitimate threat, so not bad to have a 1/1 that basically also serves the slot of this is my big evasive creature that you need to kill. I might give this like a C+. I think it's a higher pick for artifact affinity decks with some pressure, but like overall, like it's just a little bit difficult to heavily activate this. I'd actually even give it a C-. I think it is playable, potentially very good, but the fact that you have to build around it to even get the sort of base value that you want means that you can't really rate it too highly, even though it is something that you might go after pretty reasonably to fill your slot. Okay. Eviscerator's Insight. 1 and a black as an additional cost to cast this spell. Sack an artifact or a creature. Draw 2 cards. That alone is pretty bad. There's not a lot of advantage to that. It's similar to Corrupted Conviction from the other one, and the nice thing about it is that if you do it at instant speed in response to a removal, you technically gain card advantage because your opponent wasted the removal spell, and you sack the Eviscerator, sack the card to the Insight. But A, it's a little bit more expensive, and B, that effect wasn't very good because of the amount of tempo you lost and other things going on. So that's not the exciting part about this. The kind of exciting part about this is Flashback 4 and a black. Flashback 4 and a black means that you can do this twice, which does get you 2 card advantage even if your opponent is not throwing removal at things. It also means that you can potentially do the same trick twice, and if you do that, you get really good advantage, which I don't think your opponent's ever going to let you do, but, you know, it's something worth doing. I think black is already pretty glutted with different sacrifice options, and this is fairly expensive for a trick with limited access, so I'm going to give it a D. All right, Fail the Profane. 2 black black, destroy target creature or planeswalker, instant speed, and it's a land. We are not going to review these until the land set, but safe to say this is going to be an A. It's going to be a very, very strong card because it's a good removal card. So yeah, we'll talk about it a little bit more in that video. Fetid Gargantua. Okay, 4 and a black for a creature horror 4/4 with adapt 2. So it's a 4/4 that becomes a 6/6. Moths, no. um, yeah, so it's yeah, so draws 2 cards. If you do, you lose 2 life. I think this card is okay. I generally think that 5 drops need to be doing something somewhat exciting to be worth a lot of consideration. Like we saw a 5/4 in the format previously that like you could kind of tap to do some damage, and that was just pretty mid. This is a 4/4. The fact that it turns into a 6/6 does get it a little bit up above on my rating, but just like this is a place where you are kind of trying to win the game before the 7 drops come down or transition into those 7 drops. So it's a little difficult to fill this particular space, and I think you need something that's a little bit better on rate. A lot of 5 drops are like this. They generally don't have very good rate. They are kind of like weird advantage engines to kind of bridge the gap between the big closers at the top and the smaller creatures in the middle, which is why 5 drop is just sometimes a slot that you completely skip. Fetid Gargantua is potentially skippable, but also it's a 4/4 that turns into a 6/6, and it does give you card advantage when it does it. So might not be too bad. The adapt is reasonably cheap, and it's not a horrible way to draw cards. The fact that you lose 2 life is something that I'm it's very common in black, and it's not particularly great here because you're paying like the full divination cost to do it. But when you're getting a 6/6 on top of that, it's not unreasonable. I'd give this like a D plus. I think it's like probably playable, but I would really rather not. All right. Flare of Malice. Okay, so 2 black black. You can sack a non-token black creature that into the spell's cost. Each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the greatest mana value among creatures and planeswalkers they control. So Flare of Malice does the same thing as the 1 and a black creature that you can play, where it makes your opponent sacrifice a creature, but also you are probably sacrificing a creature. So it's a little bit interesting in that respect, but I would say that like mostly paying like 2 black black for this does not feel all that great. If you are playing it as an instant trick, it can lead to some pretty interesting and stunning blowouts. The fact that it hits the greatest mana value creature is really, really good. I think that's overall like the main thing that raises this from being like a C to maybe a B. The fact that it can hit planeswalkers might as well be blank text. There's just not that many times when you actually need to do that. And also, most of the planeswalkers in this format don't have particularly high mana costs. If any mana cost at all, I think they might all be 0 cost planeswalkers because they're flip planeswalkers. So yeah, there's not really much going on there. It's fairly bad versus aggro. When you block and then sacrifice cast, that changes the equation quite a bit because then you can like do a lot of interesting things to like make that happen in a much different way. I would say that there are a lot of cards that want to be sacrificed that can make this less of a losing value proposition, and I might rank it a B minus. I think it's really interesting to have 0 cost tricks in the format, and that is something that is very powerful under certain circumstances, particularly when your opponent is like 100% convinced that they've got you, and you can just basically sack a creature to make their biggest creature go away, and then crack back for all of that damage on the next turn. I think that's potentially quite strong. But even so, this is like a little bit mid. So worth considering, definitely, but it's amazingly good in some circumstances. I think it does deserve that B minus. Okay. Gravedigg. 1 and a black for a bear plus some recursion. This is effectively a Gravedigger. So it's a 2/2, and then you also get a creature card back if you entwine it, or you can do it one way or the other. So this is fine. You prefer to play this on 4, but you probably shouldn't keep it in hand if you are going to miss your 2-drop. So being able to just play it as a 2/2 black token when you don't have anything else to do on that turn, I actually think that's pretty good, especially since this card is a little bit iffy later on. You're losing some tempo getting the creature back. A lot of the creatures that you're trying to get back are not going to be as good to play back the second time. If you have a good bomb, that does make this substantially better. But it notably does have, well, it has a different amount of flexibility to a Gravedigger. It is a little bit worse than the Gravediggers in that they can't do the same, like, sort of weird Gravedigger loop that you might see with, like, an Honest Rutstein or something like that, where you can just play the card repeatedly and continue to get back the other Gravedigger or something like that. So that's something where the card doesn't build as well around itself, and it doesn't have quite as many, like, interesting synergies in that respect. Overall, this is a C. I think it's fine. It definitely does everything you want it to do. It's reasonably flexible, but it's just a little bit low on rate, and it's not as good as other 2-drops unless you have a lot of bombs, in which case it's potentially very good. All right. Grim Servant, 3 and a black for a 3/2 with a tutor. You get to search your library for a card with mana value less than or equal to your devotion to black. So once again, mono black, weirdly interesting stuff going on. But then you get to put it into your hand and shuffle. So as far as rate goes, I had this at fairly bad rate, but a 3/2 with Menace is actually not terrible. The 3 health's a lot. It might be kind of unplayable if you're under pressure, and if you're in a splash color, I just don't think you can play this really all that much, because what you're doing is getting like a 1-drop out of your hand, and that 1-drop is going to be like, I don't know, it could be something that gives you energy and draws you a card, so there's some potential on that, but overall this is like a little bit weird. Menace is kind of the worst piece of text that you could get here because it's a 4 cost, so it's just pretty easy to block with 2 creatures. Like, it's possible that your opponent's not even going to lose a creature doing it, but at the very least they can just trade pretty evenly. This does give you a bit of card advantage, but I think that the rate is bad enough that I might give this like a D plus or a C minus. It's C minus, I suppose. It does tutor, and that tutor is potentially pretty important. So yeah, that's basically where I'm at with that. I'm upgrading the D plus I currently have in my spreadsheet because I have seen this card played, and even though it was kind of bad there, I think there's some potential. All right. All right, next up is Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. Okay, Kirik is a 4 cost triple black, except it's Phyrexian black, so you can just play it for 4 if you want to pay 6 life. So every swamp in the cost can be paid with for 2 life, and in addition, every swamp in a cost of any card after you play this card can be paid for with 2 life rather than pay that mana. It has lifelink, and whenever you cast a black spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. So, you know, like a 4-mana tutu. What a great deal. It only costs you 6 life. For a 2/2 lifelink that you play for 4 mana. This is an extremely iffy value proposition. It can be out of control if it sticks, but it's just so easy to kill and so expensive. Even after it grows up, any hard removal just conks it. Phyrexian mana does give you the ability to play it in any deck if that deck is black. I got very pithy in my notes here. So yeah, the combo is to like pay life for other black cards to protect it, but that generally kills you. So you can basically be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna play Kirik, son of Yawgmoth at 4, and then I'm also gonna dump my entire hand of black cards with all of the rest of my life. If you can get exactly the right combination of black cards to make that absolutely disgusting, then that can work pretty well, because that'll make Kirik like a 5/5 or a 6/6, and then you'll be able to gain back some of that life later with your 6/6, assuming it doesn't get hard removal on it. This is a very bad rare to see in a pack. You're going to be kind of unhappy if it's in your pack 1. And like, I would say that there are 2 removal cards in the format that cost B black and black and can give you some life back. And if you have like infinity life gain early, you can definitely turn this into tempo. But this is just, oh, it should be NF, and there are just not that many circumstances where it is a better card than this. That being said, keep an eye on those lifeline cards. There are a lot of them, and they kind of help with this. Not a lot, but some. All right, Kamiya Jealous Thirst. Yeah, played with this one. It's pretty neat. 2 and a black for a Death Touch 1/3. 4 and a black, each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. This card's not going to live most of the time to see this effect, but that's fine, because a 3-drop that demands removal is generally pretty nice. Okay, this ability costs 4 and a black less to activate if you draw 3 or more cards this turn. So notably, this is a blue-black card in all but name. It's something where you can potentially get that sort of draw 3 thing going on, and then once you have that going, you can repeatedly zap your opponent and get some extra value out of it. The Death Touch means it is always going to trade. It's got some decent inevitability because you just eventually kill your opponent with damage that they can't block, and you're also getting some life on top of it, so that will give you some decent stuff. The synergy doesn't trigger that often in draft, but if you are in blue, you're not going to feel too unhappy about it. I'd say you pick this to fill out the curve, and for the blue-black control archetype, that makes it about a C-. So it's fine. I liked playing it when I played with it, but it doesn't always work in the things you want it to do. Lethal Throwdown. All right. 1 and a black for, as additional cost to sacrifice a creature, sack a creature or a modified creature. You have to destroy target creature or planeswalker, and if the modified creature is sacrificed, you draw a card. Really cool if you manage to get a +1/+1 counter on like a token that you don't really want. Like if you're like playing +1/+1 counters on all of your tokens because you have like something that buffs all of your colorless cards, or if you have like that white 4-drop 3/3 that gives you +1/+1 counters on 2 different creatures, and it's just like, okay, well I've got an extra spawn lying around, so that's nice. So yeah, that all like increases the chance that this is pretty decent. I would say that this is bad card advantage unless you're sacrificing something that you like generally a modified creature is going to be like something you would prefer to keep alive, so you don't really want to sacrifice it. And then like it's -1 card advantage if you sacrifice one of your other creatures to destroy it, because you also spend the card itself. So it's like a D. It's not great. I'd also say this is pretty extremely confusing wording. It basically should just say like sack a creature and then do X if the creature, and if the creature sacrificed was modified, draw a card. Like I don't think it should have 2 different pieces of text here as far as like additional cost stuff happens, but yeah, it's fine. All right, Marionette Apprentice. We have a 2-drop 1/2. Not usually a good sign, but it's got Fabricate, so when it enters the battlefield, it gets a +1/+1 counter, or it creates a servo, which means it does start as a 2/3. Lovely. You could play this for the servo to get sacrifice tokens, which is notable because I think there's a couple of other cards in this sort of area, and getting 2 creatures on turn 2 is generally really strong, actually. I'd say that's a pretty good rate. So good value for the sacrifice, and then also it has whenever another creature or artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. It's not an ability I value very highly because it's usually on much more expensive cards, but on a cheap, simple bear like this, it's fairly likely to trigger a couple of times. I would say it's nicer for aggressive decks than it is for control, but it's good in a curve slot for either of them because control decks are going to want to sacrifice the tokens, or they're going to want to jump block, and either one of those, this card kind of does okay. In addition, there are a lot of 1-health creatures in the format, so making a 1/1 and a 1/2 is actually much more annoying than you would expect. And not all of them have first strike, so yeah, this is potentially pretty okay. I give it a B. Minus. B minus. All right, Mindless Conscription. Okay, so 2 and a black for a 3/3 creature, which is to say it's an enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, and also whenever you draw your 3rd card each turn, you can amass zombies 3. So you can play this right into a 3-card draw. Yay. Let's get this card a little bit more in frame. So, audible cats. I'm haunted by cats and insects. All right. Yeah, we have a couple of things going on. So first things first here, this is a 3/3 creature for 3, which is always a good rate. Draw 3 is a pretty easy thing to trigger in this format. There's a ton of good draw cards in blue, so if you're playing blue-black, you feel pretty happy. You get 1 zombie token, but it either grows up to be really big and fight a bunch of Eldrazi, or your opponent kills it and you get more zombie tokens, which is great. If you're using this for sacrifice, you can definitely sack the zombie and then do some more stuff. and also that's something that you might end up doing because you might sacrifice to draw 2 cards and trigger the ability that you're doing. You can literally use this card to draw 2 cards off of a sacrifice ability, and then it will just replace itself with another zombie. So it's a card advantage and a pretty huge tempo loss if your opponent has to kill both things, the enchantment and the zombie, and killing the enchantment does not kill the zombie, so your opponent does have to kill both things. And if your opponent trades with it, you can draw the activate the draw effect even once. That's great. So yeah, I would say this is doing a lot of excellent stuff. The main thing that's a little weird about it is that it does stack weird with itself, so you basically don't want to pick 2 because it'll just make bigger zombies, which, yeah, I mean, you're okay with bigger zombies, but you'll never get 2 different 3/3s that are growing, which is kind of sad. But overall, it's a solid creature with a lot of different extra upsides and potential combo options. I would put this at a B+. I think it's always worth a pick to fill the curve. It's strong, but it's not fully insane in its archetype. All right. This card won me a lot of games in the pre-release. Nadir's Nightblade. Bad rate. It is a 3-cost 1/3. Whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. So it's specifically for Eldrazi spawn, except it doesn't create any Eldrazi spawn, so you have to combo it, which means it's mostly just a bad rate creature, and you only take it if you're in Eldrazi spawn and you want that effect, which you might not because you're in Eldrazi spawn, so you're going to be playing big creatures that kill everyone anyways. You don't really need to just sort of take your opponent down one little piece at a time. Yeah, overall, I'd say this is basically only good in synergy with those tokens. Only if you can produce and kill a ton of them. I give it a D-. Necrodominance. Hey, we printed a Necropotence. That's interesting. I never got to play Necropotence, so I'm kind of excited about this. This is like a B to an S, depending on how many vampires you have, is where I put it. Which is to say, it's an A-. Okay, so yeah, it's cool. Drop on your second main phase to refresh an empty hand, because if you don't have anything going on, you can just play it at the end of your turn and then immediately get a bunch of cards, which is awesome in draft. Certainly feels pretty good. It kills you eventually, because you have to pay a lot of life for your cards, and you no longer get the opportunity to draw cards without paying life for those cards, which means it basically completely replaces your draw mechanic with this option to draw 5 cards. Did I explain what this card does? I guess I didn't. Okay, so 3 black, skip your draw step. At the beginning of your end step, you may pay any amount of life if you do draw that many cards. Your max hand size is 5, which is minimal but important. And if a card or token would put it into your graveyard from anywhere, you exile it instead. So, reasonably fair version of Necropotence. It's not quite specific enough to be like fully build around. You can pick this up like even like pack 3 if you're in or pick 3 if you're in black, and feel pretty okay. Like you're fairly likely to be able to do whatever you want with it. You just need to make sure that you have ways to gain life. I think this is potentially busted in half. Like mono black has never looked so good, but it really only plays in one color, and like you just really kind of in draft need to take other colors some of the time. So yeah, I don't know, mono black has never looked so good, but if your opponent is picking a bunch of black cards, this starts to get pretty tricky to play. So yeah, I think it's an A-. It's an incredibly impactful card that does great things, but it's hard to play, and it's hard to play well, and it can kill you. So important to note. All right, Nethergoyf. 1 black for a creature Lurgoyf. Its power is equal to the number of card types among cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that number plus 1. So it's cheap and it's big. It has pretty weak tempo moments. It's a 0/1 on turn 1. When it escapes, it's also tiny, so it's not particularly great there. But it can eventually build up to a fairly large creature. You have to have different card types to get it active, and I think that when it escapes, it's pretty likely to just be a 0/1 again. Like there's just really not that much that you're going to have in your graveyard after you sacrifice it. You might have a creature, in which case it's a 1/2. That's pretty much nothing. I'd give this like a C+. This might be why Buried Alive exists, but you still shouldn't pick it unless you somehow pop like 3 of these. So it's medium. It could go late in packs if you want to build trash. So if you are really interested in like playing something around this deck, you can start picking cards around it and hope it wheels. But yeah, I think it's not a good card to pick early. Ophiomancer. Stalls the board. It's a 2 and a black 2/2. At the beginning of each upkeep, if you control no snakes, you create a 1/1 snake. And that snake has Death Touch, which is sure something. It is upkeep, not end step. Okay, that's good to know because that means it gives your opponent a full turn to deal with it and get rid of it. It's a 3-drop 2/2, so it's not amazing on rate, but the snake is annoying, and it is also a great sacrifice target, so not too bad. However, a lot of the sacrifice stuff does care about non-tokens, so that's kind of a disadvantage on that front. Regardless, this does give you a way to stall the board out. It trades with basically everything. Your opponent's never going to attack into that snake because generally if you're attacking into a Death Touch unit, you expect the Death Touch unit to go away. And if you know that Ophiomancer is still going to be alive at the end of it, you just can't really do much with it. So yeah, green really hates this, but I think it's probably a little closer to like a B- than a like B. It is pretty good and does some decent stuff, but it doesn't save you on against red. It's fairly hard to deal with aggro with this. It's just really, really good against like sort of the bigger things. At the very least, it does seem like a reasonable thing to have when your opponent starts playing Eldrazi because you're reasonably likely to be able to sacrifice a couple things to the Annihilator and then just block out with a Death Touch, which is, yeah, not going to lose you the game. Other things might. Okay, quest for the Necropolis. 1 and a black, and it's a landfall quest. Ooh, I missed this. This has been a long time. This was a long time ago. Was this actually in Zendikar? I think I played this set. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you put a quest counter on quest for the Necropolis. You can pay 6 for sacrifice quest for the Necropolis and put a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. This costs 1 less for each quest counter on it. So you can do this at any time on 6, but you can do it for very cheap if you play a bunch of lands. Yeah, so this is something to do early. It's a good card to play on 1. It's pretty brutal with a good creature in the opponent's graveyard, and it's also pretty brutal with a good creature in your graveyard. Most of the time, it's a 1-drop that turns into a creature later. It's reasonably fine to draw late, since 6 is not that heavy to pay if you draw it late. The landfall just means that it is basically always being played on turn 6 or 7, and, you know, it is nice if you get it down early, because you don't have to pay very much for it on turn 6 or 7, but this is always a creature. If you have any non-creatures or weak creatures, you can get into a lot of trouble. I would say this is like a B+. It's pretty good to pick, especially if you have good bombs, but it's a reasonable pick anytime. It's definitely just fills a slot, does some things, so nothing bad. It's not going to help you against aggro, but 1-drops really aren't supposed to do that all the time, so yeah, not too terrible. I guess 1-drops are kind of supposed to do that all the time, but that isn't there. It isn't required that a 1-drop do anything. All right. Refurbished Familiar. So 3 and a black for a 2/1 has affinity for artifacts. You can play it potentially very cheap. It's a flyer, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card, and if they can't, you draw a card. So it always gets 2/1 card advantage. It's a small, but not that small flyer. It's fairly cheap, it's aggressive, and it messes up your opponent's tricks, which is really, really nice. The discard can really screw up your opponents in a lot of interesting ways, and if they manage to play out of it, then there's a lot of potential problems. You could potentially make them discard a card that they don't care about, while also playing a card that they don't care about. A 2/1 flyer isn't always going to be all that scary, and they can sometimes just pitch a land and be fine, but I still give this a B-. I think the affinity is really important here. It's a really interesting example of how +1 card advantage is not always as strong as it looks, but it is pretty strong. So yeah, seems pretty neat. Retrofitted Transmogrant. So this is a 1 black for 3 and a black. It returns itself from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped with 2 +1/+1 counters on it whenever it is dead, potentially. So yeah, this is fine. It's a 1/1 that later on becomes a 3/3. It is a great sacrifice target, so there's a lot of good axes to play with. A 4-mana 3/3 for nothing is not terrible. Like, if you don't have to spend a card on it, it's certainly decent, and you're pretty happy to see it die. Your opponent will probably try to find ways to kill this without necessarily putting it in the graveyard, but that means that your opponent is spending a lot of time dealing with a 1-cost card. So yeah, I wouldn't say this is great tempo, like either at 1 or at 4. It's just not really doing amazing things on rate, but it's pretty solid value for a 1-mana common, and it makes all of those each player sacrifices a creature cards really suck for your opponent and be a lot better for you. So yeah, I'd give this a B. Maybe a B minus. Yeah, I'd lower that to a B minus. Okay, Ripples of Undeath. One and a black. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you mill 3 cards. Then you can pay 1 and 3 life. If you do, you put a card from among those cards into your hand. So it kills you, which is important to know. And 40-card deck, this is going to get you pretty fast because you are milling a lot of cards at once. But overall, this is a pretty absurd value engine. It is going to give you a card every turn. You can play it fairly early, and the thing that is a little tricky here is that the amount of life that you're paying for each card is going to make it very tough to get a maximal amount of cards out of this. You're either going to get killed by a burn spell because you paid too much, or you're not going to get enough card advantage, and then you're going to be stuck with an enchantment that slowly mills you out. I'd put this at like a C minus. It's a little too hard to build around, and the value that it gives you is a little bit of a curse sword on that front. But if you have like a nice big deck, I don't know, it's just like, it's fine. I think it's definitely doing some interesting things, and as a rare, you'd probably be pretty excited to build around it, even though it's not going to win you every game. I'm certainly going to build around it. I just don't think it's amazing. Scurrilous Sentry. 4 cost for a 2/3. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, it connives. So you draw a card and discard a card. If you discard a non-creature, it becomes a 3/4. 3/4 for 4 is still not that good on rate, but it's fine. And plus, it gets to connive again whenever it attacks, which means it eventually grows up and does some interesting things. And it puts cards into your graveyard, like Deep Analysis, or there's going to be a removal card that you can potentially throw in that might be good, although you usually want that in your hand. So yeah, good looting is reasonably strong in black. The rate is kind of bad. The way it grows is not amazing, especially since there's other creatures that grow a lot faster. It can eat your land drops, which means you can potentially like use it to avoid flooding out, which is great, and that will convert into real card advantage, I would say, in the later parts of the game when you just don't want to draw that much. I'd put this at a C. It serves its purpose, but it is definitely not doing anything well. But doing it well enough. Shilgengar, Sire of Famine. So yeah, I think we're on like... Oh yeah, no, this is a 5-cost, 6/6 flyer. Delicious. That's the kind of thing that generally just wins a game. You don't even really need to have other text on it. It's fine. Sack another creature to create a blood token. If you sacked an angel this way, create a number of blood tokens equal to its toughness instead. So it can potentially give you a bunch of cards that I think are like pay 1 to draw a card and discard a card. And they're also artifacts for affinity, which is a little bit of a bonus on top of that. That can fix you out of a bad situation, which is not a situation you're likely to be in with a 6/6 flyer on board. It's very likely to kill your opponent. The sack ability is not like incredibly high value, but it does not need to be. This card is already pretty capable of doing what it should. I'd say this is bonkers in like multi-reanimate decks, because if you have the right angel, you can just wipe your entire board and then you can resurrect the angel because you get a bunch of blood tokens off the angel. So if you've got like a 5/7 angel that you play at 7 and you sack it, you get 7 blood tokens, and then you sacrifice 6 blood tokens to return all of the angels back to the battlefield. So it's a hot mess. It's pretty wild. Yeah, I would say overall this is very, very strong. I give it an A minus. We're on to a planeswalker, aren't we? Yeah, Sword of House Markov. All right. So 2 mana, 1/4 lifelink. That's pretty good. Yeah, it's great. In fact, this is another one of the. Not all of the planeswalkers in all of the colors are going to be amazing. At least not as creatures, but a 1/4 lifelink with extort is definitely not bad. And the extort here in this case is whenever you cast a spell, you may pay a white or a black, and if you do, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain that much life. That's a pretty expensive cost to pay to like sap your opponent for 1, but not unreasonable. And we know that gaining life does have other rare synergies. There's a lot of other cards that care about having life and really want to convert that life into card advantage. There's one that puts on extort cards and pays life for that. There's an enchantment that mills you and draws cards and pays life for that. There's Necrodominance. There's the absolutely stupid vampire. So yeah, like this is a card where you're getting a decent amount of life, and it's not bad at all for a 2/2 bear. So just unflipped, card's pretty lovely. I'd definitely rate it like a high B plus, but it's a little difficult to flip, but it's not too difficult to flip. And let's go ahead and flip it, shall we? All right, Soren Ravenous Neonate is also an extort card, which is minor but fine. You can always extort. um, and then it's got a +2 ability, which is hopefully something you'll feel okay using, but definitely not something you're necessarily going to be using when you flip. So +2 to create a food token, -1 to deal damage equal to the amount of life you gain this turn to any target. And keep in mind, in order to flip this card, you have to have gained at least 3 that turn. So the -1 will always deal 3, which is crazy good. Yeah, that's a great way to just start things off. Is just like, oh yeah, I gained a bunch of life. I killed one of your small creatures, and I have a planeswalker, and you have to deal with it because it's going to gain me 100 million life. The food tokens synergize with the +1 because you can sack them for 3 life, which is great. You have to pay 2 for it, but that still allows you to deal 3 again the next turn. So you get this kind of on-turn, off-turn thing where you're playing a food token, dealing 3 damage to your opponent, playing a food token, dealing 3 damage to your opponent, and then also you're doing extorts and other stuff to deal even more damage. That's pretty wild. It's good removal. It's really, really powerful. This is like a planeswalker, and I think this makes the creature an A card. It's just great. You can play this for both of its sides, or you can just plop it down as a creature and nullify the aggro. Either way, you're really happy with Soren. He's a great card to be playing. He's always going to be good in the deck. So, good stuff. Creation of Avacyn. All right, 1 black. Find your best creature, lose it forever. Okay, so first things first. There's a 3 cost. First action is search your library for a card, exile it face down, and shuffle. Second action is turn the exiled card face up. If it's a creature card, you lose life equal to the mana value. And then the third action, you can put the exiled creature onto the battlefield, but only if it's a creature card. If you don't put it onto the battlefield, you put it into its owner's hand. So if you get an instant, then you don't lose a bunch of life, which is nice. But there's some problems with this card. So first things first, it's kind of ridiculously like rude. There's just something like very goofy and like it is a very black feeling, but I would say it's just such a mean thing to do to be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna play a card. It's an Eldrazi. It's coming out next turn. Are you ready for it? Can you beat this? The answer is yes. Most of the time they can beat this. They can destroy the enchantment, they can do something to the creature, they can plot for the creature because you're revealing it ahead of time so they know what you're doing. But like overall, this is a card that is just a 3-drop suspend your best creature for 3 mana. And 3 turns of suspend just for a creature is a lot. Like, especially if you're paying like 7 life for it. You could also suspend one of your best spells, and that's kind of neat. But yeah, I would say that overall this is like a weird rude card, but I actually wouldn't give it much more than like a D+. It's fine, but I don't think it doesn't provide any value, and there's a lot to be said for just telling your opponent exactly what you're doing and then expecting them to not have it. That usually doesn't work out all that well for you. All right, Toxic Deluge. 2 and a black as an additional cost to cast this spell. Pay X life. All creatures get -X until end of turn. Beautiful. Love it. Sweeps everything, but you die doing it. That's fine. This is more Life Matters stuff, and it's also one of the strongest Life Matters thing because it just absolutely wipes the board. It's a great Wrath. It's super strong at sweeping. It's cheap to cast, which is excellent. It means you can do a lot of stuff that you wouldn't normally be able to do. You can again selectively Wrath and kill only the creatures that have smaller health than you, which is a great way to wipe out aggro. Paying 2 life to kill all of your opponent's 2-drops can potentially backfire on you, but I wouldn't say it happens very often. And on top of that, like, you're in black, so you probably have a lot of life gain in this particular format. There's a lot of things that do this. So yeah, this is fine. I would say this is pretty good. I would even give this an A. Just because it is another one-sided Wrath effect. Black-White really has some lovely stuff to choose from in that particular arena. Victimize. 2 and a black. Choose 2 target creatures into your graveyard. You get to sack a creature. If you do, you get both of the chosen cards in return to the battlefield tapped. So if you're just doing this in like a standard deck, it's fairly neutral card advantage. You have to spend 2 cards to get 2 cards. But you do get to cycle ETB effects. You get to do some other weird stuff. the cards do come into play tapped, and that means it's fairly bad tempo because you are losing a blocker to play a sorcery spell card that will then put 2 creatures into play tapped. If your opponent is doing any kind of pressure to you at all, this becomes fairly hard to play. That being said, it's got a lot of recursive value. You can just kind of keep playing as many of these as you can pick up if you have the right like graveyard for it. The Eldrazi are maybe worth playing tapped. I'd give this like a B minus. You got to build around this a little bit, but it is very worth it, and the rate is just never going to be too unhappy as long as you can keep people off your back for long enough to actually play it. So yeah, it's reasonable. Warren Soul Trader. All right, 3 mana, 3/3. It's a pretty decent rate. Pay 1 life, sack another creature to create a treasure token. That is something that was in the Outlaws of Thunder Junction set on a tap creature, and it wasn't ridiculously amazing, but might be a little better in this format. I would say that since it can sack things for free, this potentially has a lot of high synergy, and also being a 3/3, it's a decent rate anyways. It can ramp out a big threat off of a fairly early board. The treasures are artifacts, which means you can use artifact synergy with them and affinity. It's mostly just a decent value critter. I'd give it a B minus. I think it plays, and it plays well, but it's not insanely awesome. Wither and Bloom. 1 and a black. Target creature gets -3 until end of turn. That's a pretty solid piece of removal, especially at instant speed. And then you can exile it from your graveyard for 1 and a black to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, which is a thing that you need for modified creatures, a thing that you need for tokens. Yeah, this is pretty bog standard. It doesn't kill as many things as you'd like, but the added value it gives is pretty nice, and it has some good synergies with the rest of the set. I'd give it like a B. I think removal is usually important to pick, and you want to pick it fairly highly, and like this is one where, yeah, definitely does not feel too bad. All right. Leads us to our last card, Wormcoil Larva. 3 black. It's a fairly mid-body for 5 in that it's a 3/3 Death Touch lifelink. But all of those things together do actually make for a pretty good deal in terms of stalling out your opponent's big creatures, messing with Eldrazi, and just feeling okay. Once it dies, it splits into 2 also mid artifacts, which is to say when it dies, it creates a 1/2 black Phyrexian Worm artifact creature token with Death Touch, and a 2/1 black artifact creature token with a lifelink. That helps with affinity stuff, which is kind of nice. It's pretty good to emerge from because it's a 5-cost card. So if you have that Crabomination, then that's a pretty reasonable choice. And if you have other emerge cards as well, it's a creature too, so it can emerge from those too. I'd say this is mostly too expensive to consider for sacrifice outlets, but it's reasonably likely to trade with something. It's reasonably likely to leave some stuff on the board that is fairly obnoxious for your opponent. I'd give this a C. I think it's a very playable card that actually does serve the 5 slot pretty well. And the 5 slot is, as I've mentioned, pretty hard to fill. So yeah, that is our black cards. Overall, I'd say this was pretty solid. I think black has a lot of really interesting stuff going on. It's not as reliable as white, but it is a lot more interesting to play. And a lot more interesting to play can lead to much swingier games and better stuff. So I think there's some value in these like more unreliable things with like a lot of A's and like D's and stuff, as opposed to something that just has a bunch of good cards. And like this does have a couple of like pretty sick bombs in the format. Necro Dominance, that Emperor of Bones. There's some stuff here that is just like wildly swingy, and you're gonna feel pretty happy picking black. If black gets underserved at any point, I think it gets a lot stronger to pick because the less that people are picking it, because it doesn't really synergize well with the other colors, the more you can pick just mono black decks. And mono black decks are very powerful because you've got a lot of interesting things you can do with life gain that will lead to lots of card advantage, lots of like general value, and pretty solid tempo. It's good stuff. I think it's going to be pretty worth it. Stay tuned for the next one. I believe our next color is red. So that'll be pretty fun. Everyone have a good time until the next one. We're going to be trying to release each of these every 12 hours, so expect it then. And with that, we are off. Thanks so much for watching. Ah!